Hey guys, welcome back to the second part of our journey into Haarlem's forgotten history. Last time, we explored the unremarkable crimes that quietly shaped the town's fate, from petty thefts to small brawls. But what happens when these minor infractions start revealing deeper issues within the community? How do these everyday events uncover cracks in the system, shaking the very foundation of Haarlem's once thriving society? Tonight, we're diving deeper into the simmering tensions, the silent struggles, and how the smallest acts of rebellion began to ripple through the streets, all while the town's leaders turned a blind eye to the warning signs. So, before you settle in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And again, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fun to hear where you guys are. Now, dim the lights, adjust your seat, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The silent revolution of forgotten farmers in the Dutch countryside. While much of Dutch history is dominated by tales of merchant success, naval exploration, and the rise of the mighty trading companies, there is a lesser-known story that played just as vital a role in shaping the Netherlands: the lives of the farmers in the rural regions of the country. These individuals, often overlooked in the grand narratives of commerce and political upheaval, were the ones who fed the growing urban populations, sustained the economy, and helped maintain the social fabric of the country. The story of these forgotten farmers is not one of great drama or heroic victories. It is a tale of quiet resilience, perseverance, and the unnoticed but steady changes that rippled through the Dutch countryside. In the late 16th century, the rural communities of the Netherlands were far from idyllic. Life in the countryside was tough. The weather could be cruel, the soil demanding, and the competition for land fierce. While the cities of the Netherlands were booming, especially as trade and industry grew, the lives of the farmers who worked the land were filled with small, often seemingly insignificant struggles. Yet, these everyday challenges were part of a larger transformation in the Dutch agricultural system, one that would quietly revolutionize farming practices and set the stage for the country's economic dominance in the centuries to come. The history of Dutch agriculture is often overshadowed by the grandeur of maritime trade or the paintings of Dutch Golden Age artists. But in many ways, it was the farmers who were at the heart of the nation's growth. They were the ones who worked the fertile soils of the Low Countries, growing the crops that fed the growing population and supplied the cities with the goods needed to sustain their expanding economies. The wealth and success of Dutch society were built not just on trade and industry, but on the land that sustained it. In 1599, a dispute between two neighboring farmers in a small village near the city of Zwolle provides a window into the lives of these farmers and the small but significant changes taking place in the Dutch countryside. The case involved a disagreement over the right to irrigate a piece of land. One farmer, Jan, had a small plot of land near a stream, and he had begun using the water from the stream to irrigate his crops. However, his neighbor, Peter, claimed that Jan was taking too much water and that it was affecting the irrigation of his own land further down the stream. The dispute, though small, was part of a larger pattern of conflict over the control and use of water resources that would define the next few decades in Dutch agriculture. The trial itself, held in the village court, was long and tedious. The two farmers presented their cases, each offering evidence of how the other's actions were harming their crops. The court's task was not to find the true owner of the water, but to maintain order by ensuring that both farmers could continue to work their land without causing harm to the other. The outcome of the trial was simple. John was required to reduce the amount of water he took from the stream, and Peter was ordered to improve his own irrigation system. But the case was more than just a minor land dispute. It was a reflection of the growing importance of land and water rights in the agricultural economy. In the broader context of Dutch agricultural practices, this case highlights a significant trend in the 16th century, the shift from communal farming practices to more individualized commercial agriculture. As the population grew and cities expanded, the demand for food and raw materials increased. Farmers began to experiment with new techniques and technologies to increase crop yields, and disputes like the one in Zwolle were a natural consequence of this new, more competitive system. Water, once a shared resource, was increasingly being viewed as a commodity to be controlled and fought over. In the years following this case, many farmers in the region began adopting more efficient irrigation systems, experimenting with crop rotation and new farming tools that were being introduced in the wake of the Dutch agricultural revolution. These changes were not dramatic or immediate, but over time, they transformed the way farming was done in the Netherlands. The Dutch countryside, once dominated by traditional methods of farming, became a hotbed of innovation that helped fuel the nation's growth. These changes were part of a larger pattern seen across the Netherlands in the late 16th century. The country's farmers were adapting to the growing demands of urbanization and the expanding Dutch economy. They were no longer simply subsistence farmers. They were becoming part of an increasingly complex and market-driven agricultural system. This shift, though gradual and often unnoticed at the time, laid the groundwork for the Dutch agricultural industry to become one of the most advanced in Europe in the centuries that followed. As the 16th century drew to a close, the agricultural landscape of the Netherlands began to quietly transform in ways that would have lasting effects on the nation's economic success. This transformation, though largely overlooked by the larger historical narratives, was a vital force in the rise of the Dutch Republic. The farmers of the Dutch countryside, often dismissed as humble laborers, were, in fact, at the forefront of an agricultural revolution that would support the booming urban populations and feed the growing demand for food, textiles, and raw materials in the expanding global market. The shift in Dutch agriculture during this period was not one of sudden, dramatic change, but rather a slow, steady evolution of practices and technologies. As cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam grew into economic hubs, the pressure on farmers to produce more goods in less time became increasingly apparent. With limited land and resources, Dutch farmers had to innovate or face the collapse of their livelihoods. One of the key factors driving this agricultural revolution was the increasing commercialization of farming. Farmers began to grow crops not just for their own sustenance or for local markets, but with the explicit goal of selling goods to larger urban centers and international markets. This shift meant that farming in the Dutch countryside was no longer about subsistence or local consumption. It was about maximizing profit and meeting the demands of an expanding economy. The case of Jan and Peter, the two farmers in Zwolle, was just one example of how farmers began to engage in these new commercial practices. The dispute over water rights was more than just a small, local conflict. It was a microcosm of a larger trend in Dutch agriculture. As farming became more competitive, the need for efficient and well-managed resources became paramount. The decision to improve irrigation systems and adopt more advanced techniques was part of a broader shift toward increasing productivity and meeting market demands. In the decades following the dispute in Zwolle, similar cases began to emerge across the Dutch countryside. Farmers increasingly adopted crop rotation techniques, allowing them to keep their land fertile for longer periods. They also began experimenting with new tools and farming equipment, many of which were imported from other parts of Europe. The introduction of the windmill to pump water and drain marshy land, for example, became a revolutionary tool in the Netherlands, transforming large portions of land that had once been unfit for farming into productive fields. This new approach to farming was not just about improving yields, it was about changing the way the land was seen. Once viewed as a communal resource to be shared among families, land increasingly became a commodity to be bought, sold, and fought over. Land ownership became more tied to wealth and status, and disputes over property rights became more common as the competition for land intensified. The legal system, which had traditionally dealt with land disputes through communal agreements and informal systems of justice, began to adapt to the more complex reality of a commercialized agricultural economy. One of the most significant changes during this period was the increasing reliance on cash crops. The Netherlands, with its fertile soils and well-developed agricultural infrastructure, became a key supplier of essential crops like grains, vegetables, and flax, which were in high demand for the expanding textile industry. The production of flax for linen became particularly important, as the booming textile industry in the Netherlands required a steady supply of high-quality flax. This shift toward cash crops had significant social and economic consequences. Farmers who could successfully grow crops for export became some of the wealthiest individuals in their regions, while those who struggled to adapt to the changing market found themselves left behind. In this context, the case of Jan and Peter's water dispute was not an isolated event. It was part of the larger struggle between traditional farming practices and the pressures of a more commercialized agricultural system. Water, land, and resources that were once shared or loosely managed became valuable assets to be protected and defended. The farmers of Groningen, Zeeland, and Utrecht all faced similar challenges as they navigated this transition, and their ability to adapt to the changing agricultural economy would determine their success or failure. Yet, the shift to more commercial farming did not come without its social tensions. While some farmers benefited from the new practices, others struggled to compete. The growing wealth of the merchant class and the rising landowners created a clear divide between the prosperous farmers and those who remained tied to older, less profitable agricultural methods. The tensions between these groups often played out in the courts, where disputes over land and resources became more frequent. The legal system, once focused on settling small, localized disputes, began to handle more complex cases involving property rights, contracts, and commercial interests. In addition, The transition to a more commercialized agricultural system had environmental consequences. The increased demand for land led to the drainage of marshes, the clearing of forests, and the intensification of farming practices that sometimes damaged the land. While the Dutch became pioneers in managing the land through techniques like diking and irrigation, the pressure to maximize crop yields often led to unsustainable farming practices in some areas. As we look back on the quiet revolution that took place in the Dutch countryside, we see that the story of these farmers is not one of dramatic upheaval or large scale revolt. Instead, it is a story of gradual, incremental change. The farmers of the 16th century did not overthrow systems of power or spark massive revolutions. Instead, they transformed their world through quiet innovation, adapting to the changing economic landscape and ultimately contributing to the rise of one of the world's most powerful and prosperous nations. The agricultural revolution in the Netherlands was one of the most important but least celebrated stories of the Dutch Golden Age. It was the farmers, their labor, their resourcefulness, and their ability to adapt to changing times who laid the foundation for the economic success of the Dutch Republic. The transformation of agriculture from a subsistence based system to a more commercialized and market oriented one was crucial in supporting the burgeoning trade networks and urban economies that would define the Golden Age. As the 16th century progressed, the agricultural revolution in the Netherlands slowly gave birth to an entirely new social and economic order. The innovations in farming, though often invisible to the broader historical narrative, would profoundly shape Dutch society in the years that followed. The transition from subsistence agriculture to a more commercialized, market driven approach transformed not just the countryside, but the very fabric of Dutch life, influencing the rise of urban centers, the expansion of trade, and the broader political landscape. In many ways, the commercial success of the Dutch Republic can be traced back to the fields of its farmers. The increased efficiency in agricultural production allowed the population of the Netherlands to grow, urbanize, and specialize. Cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, once small trading posts, transformed into bustling metropolises. The rising urban centers, in turn, drove the demand for more goods, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of economic growth. Farmers in the countryside, whose quiet labor had once been a relatively isolated endeavor, were now part of a vast and interconnected economy. They were providing not just food, but the raw materials necessary for the thriving industries that defined the Dutch Golden Age. Take, for example, the rise of the flax industry, which became one of the cornerstones of Dutch economic power as farmers adopted more efficient methods for growing flax using crop rotation, better soil management, and irrigation techniques. Their yields increased, and the raw material flowed into the textile mills in the cities. The production of linen became a major export, and the demand for flax pushed farmers to innovate even further. What began as a small, localized industry soon became a vital part of the global Dutch economy, with linen exports reaching as far as the Americas, Africa, and Asia. This success story was not just about the merchant traders or the shipbuilders. It was about the farmers who had, over generations, learned to master the land and adapt their practices to meet the changing demands of a growing market. These agricultural innovations also had a lasting effect on land ownership and social mobility, with land now being used more efficiently and producing more valuable crops. New classes of landowners began to emerge. Wealthy merchants and rising middle class families sought to invest in land as a way to diversify their wealth. The ability to profit from agriculture and the increasing value of land created opportunities for those who were once excluded from land ownership. This growing class of small landowners contributed to the growing economic and political stability in the Netherlands, further strengthening the position of the merchant class and consolidating the power of the bourgeoisie in the emerging Dutch Republic. However, this agricultural boom did not come without its own set of challenges. As more land was cleared and marshes drained, the environment began to feel the strain of rapid change. The process of land reclamation and irrigation, while transformative, was also an endeavor fraught with risks. The delicate balance between land management and environmental sustainability was often tested as farmers sought to increase yields and maximize profits. The increasing pressure on the land eventually led to issues of soil depletion, water management, and long-term sustainability, issues that would become even more pressing in the centuries to come. At the same time, the growth of commercial agriculture also created social divisions. While some farmers thrived, others struggled to keep pace with the rapidly changing economy. The more successful farmers, those who had the means to invest in new tools, technologies, and methods, became wealthier and more influential. Meanwhile, the poorer farmers, many of whom were still tied to older agricultural practices, faced increasing pressure. This widening gap between the prosperous landowners and the struggling tenants marked a significant shift in rural life. The changing nature of land ownership, once based on communal arrangements, now centered on individual wealth and power. Yet, even amidst these shifts, the spirit of cooperation and community that had defined rural life for centuries did not entirely fade. Farmers continued to rely on local networks of support, trading goods and sharing resources to navigate the pressures of changing agricultural practices. The courts, too, continued to play a crucial role in managing disputes and maintaining a sense of order. While the nature of these disputes changed, focusing more on land transactions, contracts, and water rights, the underlying principles of justice and fairness remained central to maintaining stability in the countryside. As we reflect on the legacy of this agricultural revolution, we realize that it was not just about the crops or the tools used in farming. It was about the people who worked the land and the profound impact they had on the course of history. The quiet resilience of these farmers, their willingness to adapt and innovate, helped to shape the economic, social, and political landscape of the Netherlands. The Dutch Golden Age, though often remembered for its art, trade, and politics, owes much of its success to the farmers in the countryside. Their quiet labor, their innovative spirit, and their ability to transform the land were the foundation upon which the wealth of the nation was built. The agricultural revolution, though largely invisible in the grand sweep of history, played a crucial role in shaping the future of the Dutch Republic, paving the way for the rise of global commerce and the economic power that would define the nation in the centuries to come. In the end, the story of the Dutch agricultural revolution is a testament to the power of quiet, incremental change While the world's attention was focused on the bustling cities, the real work was being done in the fields, where the farmers' efforts helped to feed a growing nation and lay the foundation for its future success. These forgotten farmers, whose lives were often marked by small struggles over water rights, crop yields, and land ownership, played a vital role in the rise of one of the world's most prosperous and influential nations. The Forgotten Waterways of Friesland, a silent struggle for control in the northern provinces of the Netherlands. Far from the bustling trade routes of Amsterdam and Rotterdam lies Friesland, a land of lush wetlands, winding canals, and a deeply ingrained relationship with water. While the province may not have captured the same attention in the historical narrative as its southern counterparts, Friesland played a critical role in the country's agricultural and economic development. In the 16th century, water was more than just a natural resource. It was the very lifeblood of the region. The people of Friesland lived in constant negotiation with the waterways that crisscrossed their land, and the struggle for control over these waters was a silent but significant aspect of Friesland's history. Unlike the rest of the Netherlands, where trade and industry were the driving forces of economic growth, Friesland's economy was deeply rooted in agriculture and pastoralism. The region was known for its fertile peat bogs and expansive grasslands, which were perfect for cattle farming. But to maintain the land and protect it from the ever-present threat of flooding, the Frisians needed to control the water in a way that was not only practical, but also profoundly political. The management of canals, dikes, and sluices was at the heart of Friesland's economy, and disputes over water rights became a constant source of tension between local communities, landowners, and the emerging authority of the Dutch state. In 1590, a dispute arose in the small village of Dokkum, located at the intersection of several key waterways. The case centered around the control of a crucial sluice gate, which regulated the flow of water between several farming communities. The sluice was essential for keeping the land dry and allowing farmers to cultivate their fields, but it also controlled the flow of water to the surrounding villages, including those of a powerful local family that owned extensive grazing land. The case involved two families, the Van Alva family, one of the wealthiest landowners in Friesland, and the Dekema family, a group of smaller farmers who relied on the sluice to maintain the health of their crops. The Van Alvas, with their considerable wealth and political connections, claimed ownership of the sluice, arguing that it was part of the land they had inherited. They demanded that the Dekemas pay a fee for the right to use the sluice, which had been a common practice in Friesland for generations. The Dekema family, however, challenged this claim, insisting that the sluice had historically been shared by the community and was not the sole property of the Van Alvas. The dispute was brought to the local court, where it became clear that this was not just a matter of water rights. It was a reflection of the larger struggle for power and control in Friesland. The trial, which lasted for several weeks, was a complex and tedious affair. Witnesses were called, and each side presented their evidence maps of the land, historical records, and testimonies from farmers and townsfolk who had lived in the region for years. The Van Alvas relied on their family's long-standing claim to the land, while the Dekemas argued that the sluice had been a communal asset, managed collectively by the surrounding villages to ensure fair water distribution. The court, however, was tasked with resolving a matter that went beyond the specifics of the sluice itself. The decision would set a precedent for how water rights and land ownership would be handled in Friesland moving forward. At a time when the Dutch state was consolidating its power and seeking to formalize control over the country's vital water management systems, the case was ultimately settled in favor of the Van Alva family, who were granted exclusive control over the sluice. The ruling was justified on the grounds that the sluice had been part of the family's estate for generations, and that its management was now a matter of private property rather than communal use. The Dekema family was forced to pay a fee for access to the sluice, marking the beginning of a trend in Friesland where water management increasingly became a commodity controlled by wealthy landowners. The ruling was a blow to the traditional communal practices of water management that had been prevalent in Friesland for centuries, but it was a sign of the shifting balance of power between the old rural practices and the emerging commercial order of the Netherlands. This case, though seemingly mundane, was deeply significant for Friesland and for the broader Dutch society. It highlighted the increasing privatization of resources that had once been managed communally and the rising influence of wealthy landowners who could use their control over resources like water to solidify their power. As the Dutch state sought to expand and control its economy, the management of water became not just a local concern, but a key part of the nation's economic infrastructure. The control of waterways, once the domain of local communities and small-scale farmers, was now increasingly tied to political and economic power. The Van Alves, through their wealth and influence, were able to secure not just control of the sluice, but a larger stake in the changing order of the Dutch state. The ruling also had profound implications for the farmers and smaller landowners who depended on water to cultivate their crops. With the Van Alves holding exclusive control over the sluice, many of the smaller farmers who had previously shared in its management were now at the mercy of a new system where access to water was determined by economic power rather than communal rights. The Dekema family's loss of access to the sluice marked the beginning of a more commercialized agricultural system in Friesland, where the ability to control land and water became a determining factor in social and economic status. As we reflect on this case, we begin to see that the control of water in Friesland was not just about maintaining land, it was about maintaining power. The rising influence of wealthy landowners, like the Van Alves, was part of a broader trend in Dutch society, where economic power increasingly resided in the hands of those who controlled vital resources. The case in Dokkum, though seemingly about a minor dispute over a sluice gate, was part of a larger shift in the way land, water, and power were distributed in Friesland and the rest of the Netherlands. As the 16th century progressed and the Dutch Republic solidified its power, the control of water and the resources that came with it became an increasingly significant economic and social issue. The case of the Van Alva and Dekema families was just one of many such disputes that occurred in Friesland and throughout the Low Countries. In Friesland, where land was often swampy and marshy, and where much of the region's agricultural success relied on the careful management of water, access to water resources like sluices, dikes, and canals could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. This was particularly important in a region where agriculture was the backbone of the economy. Farmers in Friesland relied on the management of water for irrigation, drainage, and protection from flooding. The land, although fertile, was susceptible to the seasonal flooding of rivers and the encroachment of the sea. In order to make the most of the land, farmers needed to control the water, ensuring their fields stayed dry when needed and that crops could be irrigated during dry spells. This task required sophisticated networks of sluices and dikes, which were carefully managed to maintain the delicate balance of water levels. Before the growing dominance of wealthy landowners like the Van Elves, these systems were often managed communally. Villages, towns, and neighboring farms shared responsibility for maintaining water levels and ensuring the success of the land. However, as commercial farming became more prominent and the region's economy became more market-oriented, control over water resources increasingly shifted to the hands of a few wealthy landowners. This created a social divide between those who could afford to control access to water and those who could not. The Van Elves, by winning the court case, not only gained control over the sluice, but also solidified their position in Friesland's economic hierarchy. Their victory was a sign of the larger shift toward privatization and commercial control of resources in the Netherlands. This shift had profound implications for the rest of the community. Small-scale farmers, who once had equal access to resources like water, found themselves increasingly dependent on the whims of the wealthier landowners, who now held exclusive rights over the most critical elements of farming. For farmers like the Dekimas, this meant that they were no longer able to rely on communal water systems. Instead, they had to negotiate with powerful landowners for access to the water they needed to sustain their crops. For the Van Elves, the legal victory meant not just control over water, but the ability to dictate terms and extract payments for access to vital resources. Their success in the court didn't just mark a personal win, it was part of a larger economic trend where control of water resources became inextricably linked to wealth and power. The economic consequences of this shift were far-reaching. The wealth generated by the control of water resources allowed families like the Van Elves to invest in new agricultural technologies, expand their estates, and increase their influence in local governance. Meanwhile, the Dekimas and other smaller farmers found themselves increasingly marginalized, their access to resources limited by the growing power of landowners who controlled the water. This created a widening gap between the prosperous merchant class and the struggling agricultural class. Water control also became a political tool in Friesland, as the Dutch state sought to expand its influence and solidify its control over the Low Countries. The regulation and management of water became a key aspect of governance. Dikes, canals, and sluices were no longer just tools for farming, they were mechanisms of power. The government, in collaboration with wealthy landowners, increasingly took over the responsibility for regulating water resources, formalizing control over these vital systems. The legal and economic power of those who controlled water resources was increasingly recognized by the state, and the ability to manage water became a marker of social status and authority. In this environment, the role of the local court in Friesland became more significant. Legal battles over land and water were no longer just personal disputes. They were part of the larger process of consolidating power and wealth in the hands of a few. The court in Dokkum, by ruling in favor of the Van Elves, not only resolved a dispute between two families, but also reinforced the social and economic changes taking place in Friesland. The ruling demonstrated that the legal system had become an essential tool for ensuring the dominance of the wealthier landowners over the resources that were essential for agricultural life. Yet, this shift also created tensions. As the wealth of a few families grew, resentment began to build among the smaller farmers who were left behind. The changing structure of land ownership and water rights led to social instability as the once shared resources became privatized and increasingly difficult to access. Farmers who once worked the land with relative independence now found themselves dependent on the larger landowners who could charge for access to water and control vital resources. This dependence created a power imbalance that undermined the sense of community that had once characterized rural life in Friesland. The rise of commercial agriculture and the privatization of water resources also had environmental consequences. The need to drain marshy land and control water levels led to significant changes in the landscape. While this allowed for more intensive farming, it also resulted in the loss of wetlands and the degradation of ecosystems that had once been integral to Friesland's landscape. The ecological balance, carefully managed by farmers over centuries, was disrupted by the growing pressure to increase agricultural productivity. The long-term sustainability of such practices would come into question in the following centuries, as the environmental costs of such rapid changes became more apparent. As we reflect on this case and the broader changes taking place in Friesland, we realize that the story of water control is not just about land ownership or economic success. It is about power, the power to shape the land, the power to control vital resources, and the power to determine who has access to the means of survival. The ruling in Dockham, though seemingly about a small legal dispute, was part of a much larger transformation that was taking place in Friesland, and by extension, in the Netherlands as a whole. It reflected the growing influence of the merchant class and the increasing commercialization of agriculture, while also highlighting the tensions and inequalities that arose from this shift. As the 16th century came to a close, Friesland, like much of the Dutch countryside, was entering a new era, one where the interplay between land, water, and power would reshape not just the region's agricultural landscape, but its social and political order. The case between the Van Alva and De Kema families, while seemingly a small and isolated dispute over a sluice gate, was indicative of a larger, more significant shift in Friesland and the broader Netherlands. In the decades that followed the trial, the control of water continued to be a defining issue in Friesland. The legal battles and social struggles over water rights were not just confined to a few isolated instances. They reflected the growing pressures of a rapidly changing society. The Dutch economy was becoming increasingly dependent on its agricultural output, and water management was at the heart of this transformation. The once communal systems of irrigation and drainage that had sustained Friesland for generations began to give way to a more privatized system where landowners controlled not just the land, but the vital resources that made it productive. The Van Alva family's victory was just one chapter in the larger story of how the Dutch agricultural revolution unfolded, as larger, wealthier families like the Van Alvas consolidated their control over water. The smaller farmers, who had traditionally relied on communal water management, began to face growing difficulties. The economic disparities between the landowning elites and the smaller, poorer farmers became more pronounced, as the ability to access and control water became synonymous with power and wealth. Those who could afford the costs of controlling and managing water could thrive, while those who could not were left vulnerable to the whims of the wealthier landowners. By the early 17th century, the broader Dutch society was beginning to reflect these changes. The rise of the merchant class, bolstered by the successes of the Dutch East India Company and the expanding global trade networks, created a new class of wealthy landowners who used their agricultural success to build their wealth and influence. The old systems of land ownership, once rooted in feudal traditions and communal practices, were increasingly replaced by more formalized property rights and economic systems. This shift was especially evident in the rural regions like Friesland, where the management of water was no longer just a matter of necessity for farming. It had become a tool for social control. However, the transformation in Friesland's social and agricultural systems was not without its consequences. While the wealth and power of the landowning elite grew, the growing divisions between the wealthy and the poor farmers created tensions. The once cooperative agricultural communities, where neighbors relied on each other to manage shared resources, were increasingly divided along economic lines. The older communal practices that had once bound communities together began to erode, replaced by a more fragmented and competitive agricultural system. The legal battles over water rights that played out in courts across Friesland became symbolic of these growing divisions. Yet, despite these changes, Friesland's farmers were not passive participants in this transformation. Over time, they began to adapt, using the very system that had been established by the wealthy landowners to fight back and secure their rights. While the legal system increasingly favored the powerful, the farmers began to form new alliances, often negotiating for better access to water, land, and resources. In some cases, they used their collective strength to push for reforms, and in others, they turned to local courts to challenge the power of the landowners. The fight for water, once a silent struggle, became a more organized effort to reclaim rights that had been lost with the rise of commercial agriculture. The legacy of the struggles over water control in Friesland extends far beyond the 16th century. It is a reminder of how deeply intertwined resource management, social structures, and legal systems are. The control of water, which may seem like a simple matter of irrigation or drainage, was, in fact, a central pillar of the Dutch agricultural system, and its management played a crucial role in shaping the economic and social landscapes of the Netherlands as the country moved toward its golden age. The lessons learned in Friesland about resource management, land ownership, and social inequality would influence the broader political and economic transformations that followed. Moreover, the transformation of Friesland's agricultural system was not just about the rise of the merchant class and the growing power of landowners. It was also about the beginning of a new understanding of the relationship between land, labor, and legal rights. The farmers of Friesland, even as they struggled against the increasing power of the wealthy landowners, were beginning to shape the future of the Dutch legal system. The disputes over water rights in the small villages of Friesland laid the groundwork for the more formalized systems of land and water management that would come to define the Netherlands. As we reflect on the legacy of these water disputes and the broader changes that they represent, we are reminded of how deeply the environment, economic systems, and social structures are connected. The farmers of Friesland, through their quiet, often overlooked struggles, helped to shape the future of the Dutch Republic. Their efforts to control and manage the land and water were part of a larger effort to build a more structured and organized society, one where land, water, and resources were no longer just communal assets, but valuable commodities controlled by those with the power to enforce their rights. The story of Friesland's water disputes, while hidden beneath the surface of more well-known events in Dutch history, is a reminder that the most significant changes often come from the most mundane of struggles. It was the quiet battles over water, land, and resources that helped to define the shape of Dutch society, setting the stage for the growth of the Dutch Golden Age. The overlooked mariners of the Dutch Republic, quiet builders of maritime power, while the Dutch East India Company and the mighty naval fleets of the Netherlands are often celebrated as the foundations of the Dutch maritime empire. There is a hidden story that rarely receives the attention it deserves. This is the story of the ordinary mariners, the unsung sailors, shipwrights, and dock workers whose labor and expertise were crucial to the construction and maintenance of the vast naval power that propelled the Dutch Republic into the world's spotlight. These were the individuals who did not command ships or fleets, but were the backbone of the country's maritime successes. Without them, the triumphs of Dutch commerce, exploration, and naval warfare might never have been possible. The 16th century was a time of immense maritime expansion. The Dutch Republic, with its superior shipbuilding techniques and ambitious global trade ambitions, rapidly built a reputation as one of the world's leading maritime powers. The East India Company's voyages to the Far East and the West India Company's trade with the Americas are well documented, but the stories of the hundreds, if not thousands of men who sailed aboard these vessels, maintained their strength, and built them from the ground up, remain largely absent from mainstream histories. In 1598, in the city of Haarlem, a dispute arose between two shipbuilding guilds over the construction of a series of warships commissioned for the growing Dutch fleet. The case, while involving some well-known local shipbuilders, also highlighted the hidden role of the workers who were responsible for the actual labor behind the creation of these monumental ships. These workers, ranging from carpenters and blacksmiths to riggers and sailmakers, were not celebrated in the same way as the merchants or captains. Yet their craftsmanship was the key to the success of the Dutch maritime endeavors. The guilds involved in the dispute over the warships represented two factions within the shipbuilding community. One guild, led by the influential shipbuilder Jan van Dyck, was known for its experience in constructing large merchant vessels, while the other, headed by the younger, ambitious Hendrik de Vries, was dedicated to the specialized skills needed for building warships. The conflict arose when the Dutch government, seeking to expand its naval fleet, decided to use a new set of specifications for the warships that differed from traditional merchant vessel designs. This new approach required significant innovation, which both guilds claimed to be best suited to execute. While the public and the elite members of the Dutch government focused on the political implications of the fleet expansion, the real drama unfolded in the shipyards. Van Dyck and de Vries had differing visions on how to adapt to the new requirements. Van Dyck's guild, made up of older, more traditional shipbuilders, favored a slower but more proven method, while De Vries's guild, consisting largely of younger craftsmen eager to prove themselves, pushed for faster, more radical experimentation with ship design. The trial that followed was an unusual one in that it brought to light not just the intricacies of shipbuilding, but the social and economic importance of the laborers who carried out the work. The workers themselves, many of whom had been toiling in the shipyards for years, were called as witnesses to testify to the methods, the materials, and the skills used in constructing the ships. These men were the real architects of Dutch naval power, yet their voices were rarely heard. Most were not landowners or wealthy merchants. They were artisans and laborers whose work, though vital, was considered secondary to the political and economic powers at play. The case eventually led to a compromise, with the two guilds agreeing to share the workload based on their areas of expertise. The warships were built, and the Dutch fleet grew in both size and capability, enabling the Dutch Republic to project power across the globe. The mariners, however, continued to work in the background, unsung and often invisible in the larger narratives of naval warfare and global trade. This story, though only one small piece of the larger maritime revolution, is indicative of the larger reality of Dutch seafaring success. The Dutch were able to dominate the seas in the 17th century, not just because of their wealth and the ambition of their trading companies, but because of the thousands of skilled laborers, sailors, shipbuilders, dock workers, and artisans who made their maritime ambitions possible. The role of these workers was one of continuous, quiet labor, often without recognition or fame. In the broader context of the Dutch Golden Age, the workers behind the scenes played a crucial role in transforming the Netherlands into the world's most powerful maritime nation. The Dutch merchant fleets, which would go on to dominate global trade, were largely built by these forgotten mariners. The ships themselves, often beautiful, innovative creations, represented the triumphs of human ingenuity, but they were only possible through the tireless work of those who crafted and maintained them. But how many more stories like this exist? How many other forgotten workers, whose labor was critical to the success of the Dutch economy, have been left out of the traditional narrative? In a time when merchant ships were the lifeblood of the country, and naval power was essential to securing trade routes and global influence, it is striking how few of the mariners and artisans who made it all possible are remembered today. While the great names of Dutch maritime history, like the captains of the Dutch East India Company and the bold admirals of naval battles, are often remembered, the story of the sailors and shipbuilders who made these great feats possible remains largely in the shadows. These individuals, whose labor was central to the Dutch maritime success, were the unseen forces that allowed the country to rise as a naval power, dominating trade routes across the world. The sailors aboard Dutch ships, though often celebrated for their bravery in battles, rarely received the recognition they deserved for their contributions to the Dutch economy and the expansion of Dutch influence. This was especially true for those who served in less glamorous positions. Deckhands, navigators, carpenters, and riggers, whose work was critical to ensuring the smooth operation of the ships. These men, without whom the Dutch maritime empire would have been impossible, remained faceless in the historical narrative. overshadowed by the grandeur of the captains and the merchants who traded on their efforts. One such story from 1603, set in the bustling port city of Delft, offers a glimpse into the lives of these forgotten mariners. The city was home to a large shipbuilding yard that catered to the growing demands of the Dutch Navy and merchant fleet. This yard, like many others in the Netherlands, was a hub of activity where skilled laborers toiled away, building the ships that would form the backbone of Dutch maritime power. A dispute arose in the shipyard over the design and construction of a new fleet of merchant vessels. The Dutch East India Company had placed an order for a new class of ships designed for long voyages to Asia, and the shipbuilders were under immense pressure to deliver the vessels on time. Tensions between the shipbuilders, carpenters, and riggers escalated when disagreements arose over the ship design and the materials that should be used. The workers, many of whom had been in the shipbuilding business for generations, argued that the new design was flawed, with too many risks for durability on long voyages. They believed the ships, while fast, would not be able to withstand the storms and harsh conditions of the Indian Ocean. The shipyard's overseer, a man named Peter de Vries, was a seasoned veteran of the shipbuilding trade. He had seen the evolution of ship designs over the years and was caught between two factions: those who wanted to stick to traditional, proven methods, and those who saw the new designs as an opportunity to push Dutch naval technology to new heights. De Vries, like many of his colleagues, understood the pressures of the moment. He was caught between maintaining the reputation of Dutch shipbuilding excellence and meeting the demands of a rapidly expanding Dutch empire. The workers in the shipyard, many of whom were skilled but unrecognized artisans, formed a loose collective. They were mostly drawn from the lower ranks of the maritime worldmen, whose names were never recorded in the official accounts, but whose hands shaped the very vessels that helped make the Dutch Republic one of the richest nations in the world. These mariners and craftsmen understood the delicate balance required to build ships that could travel great distances across the oceans and withstand the immense pressure of international trade and naval warfare. The workers of the Delft shipyard, after much deliberation and testing, came to a decision. They agreed to compromise on the design, but insisted on stronger reinforcements for the ships, particularly along the hulls and masts. Their design alterations, though small, were critical to the safety of the ships that would later sail to the farthest corners of the world. They did not receive the accolades or the fame given to the ship captains or the wealthy merchants who profited from the trade. Instead, their contributions went largely unacknowledged, and the success of the vessels they helped to craft was attributed to the men who sailed them and the trading companies that commissioned them. However, the legacy of these forgotten mariners and shipbuilders lives on in the success of the Dutch East India Company and the prosperity of the Dutch Republic. The ability of Dutch vessels to navigate the treacherous seas of the East Indies and beyond, the reliability of the ships, and the success of Dutch trade were all inextricably tied to the skilled labor of these men. The shipbuilders of Delft and other towns along the Dutch coast were the unsung architects of the Dutch maritime empire, their craftsmanship and ingenuity quietly sustaining a global network of trade, diplomacy, and naval power. As we reflect on these forgotten mariners, it is impossible to ignore the larger implications of their work. The success of Dutch shipping was built on the backs of these humble laborers, men who toiled in anonymity to ensure that the ships of the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch Navy were among the most formidable in the world. The importance of their contribution cannot be overstated. Without these unsung heroes, the Dutch Republic would not have been able to establish its dominant position in global trade and maritime power. The shift in maritime technology, pioneered by these workers, was part of a broader trend in which ordinary laborers, through their quiet but essential contributions, drove the growth of an entire nation. The Dutch were able to dominate the seas, not just because of the wealth and ambition of the East India Company, but because of the thousands of mariners, artisans, and workers who made that success possible. Their legacy is intertwined with the success of the Dutch Golden Age and serves as a reminder that history is often shaped not by the actions of a few celebrated individuals, but by the cumulative efforts of countless ordinary people. As we look back on the remarkable achievements of the Dutch maritime empire, let us remember the invisible men, the sailors, shipbuilders, and craftsmen whose quiet labor, though rarely acknowledged, was integral to the success of the Dutch Republic. Their work was not glamorous, but it was essential to the very foundation of the Dutch Empire, the quiet rebellion of the Dutch farmers, the rise of agricultural protest, while the grand political revolutions and naval conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries often dominate the historical narrative of the Dutch Republic. There is a quieter story of resistance that took place in the rural heartlands. This is the story of the farmers who, though far removed from the corridors of power, were often at the forefront of local protests, especially against unfair taxation and economic policies that threatened their livelihoods. While the larger events of the Dutch Golden Age, such as the wars with Spain and the rise of the Dutch East India Company, are widely known, the struggles of the Dutch farmers remain largely overlooked in mainstream histories. In 1607, a protest emerged in the northern provinces of the Netherlands, specifically in Friesland and Groningen, that would quietly stir the foundations of Dutch rural society. The issue at the heart of the protest was the imposition of a new agricultural tax levied by the provincial governments. This tax, which was designed to fund military campaigns and state-building efforts, was seen by many farmers as an unfair burden. For these farmers, already struggling with low crop yields and a harsh climate, the new tax was just one more factor that threatened their survival. The tax, though modest by urban standards, was crippling for rural families who had little disposable income. Farmers, many of whom had inherited their land from previous generations, found themselves caught between the demands of the government and the pressure of making a living from increasingly barren soil. The new tax was based on the quantity of produce harvested, meaning that those who grew more were taxed more heavily, putting those with lower yields at an even greater disadvantage. The protest began in Friesland, where a group of farmers, led by a man named Klaas de Vries, organized a petition to the provincial government. Klaas, a middle-aged farmer who had spent most of his life working the land, became a leader of the protest not out of a desire for fame or glory, but because he had seen firsthand the struggles of his fellow farmers. Klaas's father had been a farmer before him, and his grandfather before that. The family had worked the same fields for generations, but recent years had been hard. Flooding, poor harvests, and rising taxes had eaten into his profits. His story was not unique. Many of the farmers in Friesland and Groningen were struggling under the same conditions. Klaas and his group of protesters argued that the new tax was not only unfair, but also destructive to the agricultural economy. They claimed that it would drive many farmers to ruin, pushing them further into debt and leaving them unable to produce enough to sustain their families. In their petition, they asked for the tax to be repealed or reduced, arguing that farmers should not bear the burden of funding the state's military ventures when they were already struggling to survive. The protest quickly gained traction, with farmers from surrounding villages joining the movement. What began as a petition soon turned into a larger movement, with demonstrations, petitions, and public gatherings. In Friesland, farmers refused to pay the new tax, and some even staged small-scale strikes in protest. In the rural heartlands of the Netherlands, where life was often dictated by the seasons and the harvest, the farmers' revolt was a reflection of the deep frustrations they felt toward a government that seemed disconnected from their daily struggles. The authorities, however, were not easily swayed. The Dutch government, already engaged in the long struggle for independence from Spain, could not afford to lose control over its provinces, and it viewed the farmers' protest as a challenge to its authority. Local magistrates and tax collectors were sent to Friesland to enforce the new tax and suppress the uprising. In response, Klaas and his followers organized a series of direct actions, blocking roads and preventing tax collectors from collecting payments. The conflict escalated, but the Dutch government, under the leadership of the provincial governors, eventually compromised. In the face of widespread unrest and the potential for the protest to spread to other regions, the government agreed to reduce the tax on agricultural produce. Klaas and his followers, though not receiving all they had demanded, had secured a victory of sorts, a recognition of the hardships faced by the farming communities, and a concession from the government that acknowledged their struggles. This victory was not only a political win for the farmers of Friesland and Groningen, it was a turning point in the relationship between the rural communities and the Dutch state. The success of the protest demonstrated that the farmers, though often seen as the quiet laborers of Dutch society, were capable of organizing and exerting influence on the political system. This moment would have lasting effects on the way rural communities were treated by the government in the years to come. The farmers of the Dutch Republic, though often overlooked in the grand narratives of history, were not passive subjects. They were active participants in the political life of the nation, using the tools available to them: protest, petition, and direct action to challenge policies that threatened their way of life. The success of the 1607 protest was a reminder that even the smallest communities, those seemingly distant from the centers of power, could have an impact on the larger political landscape. As we look back on this forgotten chapter of Dutch history, we begin to see the power of rural communities in shaping the course of the nation's development. The farmers who protested in Friesland and Groningen in 1607 were not just fighting against an unfair tax, they were asserting their right to have a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. Their quiet rebellion, though not dramatic or violent, was a reflection of the resilience and determination that defined the Dutch spirit. In the wake of the 1607 protest in Friesland and Groningen, the farmers of the Dutch Republic, once largely marginalized in the political sphere, began to realize their potential as a force for change. The success of Klaas de Vries and his fellow farmers demonstrated that even in a society dominated by wealthy merchants, traders, and political elites, ordinary people from the rural heartlands could disrupt the status quo and make their voices heard. The protest not only led to tangible victories, like the reduction of the agricultural tax, but also laid the groundwork for a new political awareness among the rural population of the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic was founded on principles of trade, industry, and governance by city elites. Its rise as a global power was rooted in its bustling urban centers, where commerce and maritime trade were the engines of its wealth. Yet, the country's ability to sustain this power depended heavily on its agricultural base, which supplied not only food for the growing population, but raw materials like flax, timber, and grain that fueled the economy. The rural areas, though often underrepresented in political discourse, were vital to the nation's success. The 1607 protest and its aftermath were emblematic of the broader political shift that would take place in the following decades. Farmers across the country began to see themselves as integral to the stability of the state, not merely as laborers who worked the land, but as active participants in shaping the laws and policies that governed them. This realization sparked further agitation and awareness of the power that rural communities held, even if they lacked the wealth or urban influence of the merchant class. The immediate result of the Friesland protests was a temporary political truce. The Dutch government, faced with widespread unrest, had little choice but to adjust its policies. The rural population had sent a clear message that they were not to be ignored. While the government reduced the tax burden on agricultural produce, this shift in policy was only one part of a larger transformation. It signified the beginning of a series of negotiations between the rural farmers and urban elites, marking the start of a more inclusive, though still asymmetrical, political dialogue. Over the next few decades, rural communities in the Netherlands would continue to press for political representation and reform. In the cities, meanwhile, the economic interests of the merchant class grew stronger, pushing their own agendas for taxation and regulation that often left rural areas behind. Yet, the 1607 protest had demonstrated that farmers were not without recourse. As the Dutch Republic continued to thrive as a maritime and economic power, the rural working class began to push for a greater role in governance, advocating for tax reform, fairer land distribution, and better recognition of their contributions to the nation's economic success. The protest also revealed another key shift in the political landscape of the Dutch Republic: the rise of agrarian activism. As farmers grew more conscious of their collective power, they started to form alliances. In Friesland and Groningen, as well as in other provinces, rural communities began to organize petitions, hold meetings, and even coordinate protests. These efforts, though still fragmented, laid the foundation for more formalized movements that would gain momentum in the years to come. This wave of agrarian activism did not go unnoticed by the urban elite. As the Dutch economy flourished, with the rise of the Dutch East India Company and the thriving trade routes to the Americas, the state began to recognize the importance of maintaining stability in the countryside. Although the economic center of gravity in the Netherlands was firmly anchored in the cities, the state understood that the prosperity of the merchant classes depended on the smooth functioning of agriculture Hence, the ruling elites were forced to adjust their policies to balance the interests of both urban and rural constituencies. This delicate balance between urban wealth and rural power would become a defining feature of Dutch governance during the 17th century. One of the key changes in the aftermath of the protests was the formalization of the agrarian voice in political negotiations. Farmers were no longer viewed simply as subjects to be taxed or managed by the state. They were beginning to be seen as stakeholders with legitimate interests that needed to be addressed. The government, aware of the rising tension between the rural and urban populations, began to include representatives of the farming communities in provincial councils and other governing bodies. These farmers, though still marginalized in comparison to the merchant class, now had a seat at the table in matters that affected their livelihoods. The growing awareness of rural interests had long-term implications for the structure of the Dutch Republic. While urban elites dominated politics and economics, the political structure began to recognize the importance of rural constituencies, particularly in agricultural regions like Friesland, Zeeland, and Groningen. In many ways, this shift in political consciousness mirrored broader European trends in which rural populations, long excluded from political decision-making, began to demand recognition and influence. The farmers of Friesland, led by Klaas de Vries and his fellow activists, were instrumental in this shift. Their success in 1607 was a precursor to the larger agricultural reforms that would take place in the Netherlands during the 17th century. By making their voices heard, they not only achieved immediate relief, but also helped to redefine the role of the rural working class in Dutch politics, setting a precedent for future political engagement. This story of rural protest and gradual political recognition in the Dutch Republic is a reminder that the history of a nation is shaped not just by the grand events that dominate the political stage, but by the quieter, more localized struggles of ordinary people. The farmers of Friesland, though largely forgotten by mainstream historical narratives, played a pivotal role in shaping the future of Dutch governance. Their quiet rebellion, though largely overshadowed by the more dramatic events of the time, was one of the key moments in the evolution of the Dutch Republic's political system. As the years passed following the 1607 protest in Friesland, the lessons of that quiet rebellion reverberated through the rural communities of the Dutch Republic. The farmers' struggle for fair taxation and recognition of their contributions to the Dutch economy was not an isolated event. It marked the beginning of a larger political shift that would continue to unfold in the decades to come. While the immediate victory of the protest may have been a reduction in agricultural taxes, the true significance of the farmers' actions lay in the way they reshaped the relationship between the rural populations and the central government. The farmers of Friesland and Groningen had, in essence, introduced a new model of political engagement. While they had once been largely outside the formal political systems of the Netherlands, their collective efforts during the protest highlighted the power of rural activism and the importance of rural interests in the national political conversation. This shift did not happen overnight, but over the following decades, the impact of the 1607 protest would influence not only agricultural policy, but also the broader political landscape of the Dutch Republic. In the years following the protest, rural communities continued to organize and assert their rights, particularly in relation to agricultural taxation land ownership, and access to resources like water. The Dutch state, which had once been relatively indifferent to rural concerns, began to realize the importance of maintaining peace and stability in the countryside. The growing influence of the farmers was a signal to the urban elites and provincial governments that rural unrest could no longer be ignored. By the early 17th century, the government had begun to formalize a system of rural representation in political decisions. Farmers, once relegated to the margins of political life, were increasingly seen as essential contributors to the Dutch economy. Their demands for fair treatment and recognition led to the creation of agricultural councils in several provinces, where rural interests could be formally represented. While these councils were still dominated by landowners and local elites, they were an important step toward giving rural populations a more active role in governance. One of the most significant long-term consequences of the agricultural protests was the gradual shift in the way the Dutch state viewed agricultural production. The success of the Dutch economy in the 17th century was not solely due to the profits generated by the merchant and industrial classes. It was also heavily reliant on the output of the nation's farms. The Dutch Republic's dominance in global trade depended on a reliable supply of goods like grain, flax, and livestock, and it was the farmers who ensured that this supply remained constant. As a result, the Dutch state began to adopt more supportive policies toward agriculture, acknowledging its crucial role in sustaining the growing economy. Moreover, the rise of rural activism had broader social implications. The protests of 1607 and the subsequent shifts in agricultural policy contributed to a more complex class structure in the Dutch countryside. The growing division between wealthy landowners and smaller farmers deepened over time, creating tensions that would eventually be felt in both the political and economic spheres. Wealthier landowners, who had the resources to invest in new agricultural technologies and maintain control over critical water resources, found themselves in a stronger position relative to smaller farmers. This economic divide fueled further protests and demands for land reform, particularly as the Dutch Republic entered its golden age. Another key consequence of the agricultural protests was the changing nature of rural governance. As the rural population gained a stronger voice in political matters, the traditional systems of local governance, largely based on feudal customs, began to be replaced by more centralized forms of administration. This centralization of power was both a response to the growing influence of rural populations and a reflection of the broader political trends in the Dutch Republic, where the central government sought to assert greater control over the provinces. The shift towards centralized governance also allowed for more efficient management of agricultural resources, which was essential for maintaining the balance between urban and rural needs. In the context of the Dutch Republic's maritime dominance, the relationship between the land and the sea became increasingly important. The growing commercial agriculture sector, buoyed by the rise of a wealthier merchant class, was intrinsically linked to the success of Dutch trade. The need to manage and regulate the flow of resources from the countryside to the cities and beyond was one of the key challenges of the time. As rural farmers pushed for better policies and fairer representation, their struggle inadvertently shaped the relationship between agriculture, industry, and trade, which would become one of the driving forces behind the Dutch Golden Age. While the farmers' protest of 1607 is often overshadowed by the dramatic political and military events of the time, it serves as a critical moment in the development of Dutch political thought and rural activism. It demonstrated that even in an economy dominated by trade, agriculture remained a vital pillar of Dutch society. The farmers' ability to organize, protest, and secure concessions from the state marked the beginning of a new era of rural engagement in Dutch political life. The legacy of this early rural activism would continue to shape the Dutch Republic's policies and governance in the centuries to come. The story of the forgotten farmers of the Dutch Republic reminds us that history is not only shaped by the actions of grand figures or dramatic events, it is also shaped by the quiet struggles of ordinary people who fight for fairness, recognition, and a better way of life. The farmers of Friesland, through their persistence and unity, played a key role in securing a place for rural communities in the political life of the Netherlands, ensuring that their needs were considered alongside the more powerful urban elites. Their fight for fair taxation and a just political system was part of the larger narrative of the Dutch Republic's rise, one that would be built not only on trade and commerce, but also on the hard work and quiet resistance of the Dutch people. The quiet strength of the fishermen of Zeeland, the unsung guardians of Dutch trade, while the merchant ships of the Dutch East India Company and the vast trade routes that stretched across the globe have long been celebrated as the hallmark of the Dutch Golden Age. There is a lesser known but equally crucial part of the Dutch maritime story. This is the story of Zeeland's fishermen, whose contributions to the country's trade and economy are often overlooked in favor of the more glamorous narratives of imperial expansion and global commerce. Yet these fishermen, working on the fringes of the Dutch Republic's great trading empire, were the unsung guardians of the nation's maritime power. Zeeland, a province in the southwestern Netherlands, was historically known for its vast coastline, scattered islands, and deep connections to the sea. While its role in global trade may not have been as prominent as the larger cities of Amsterdam or Rotterdam, Zeeland was vital to the Dutch economy. The province's waters were rich in fish, and its fishermen were essential to the country's trade network. They supplied not just the domestic market, but also served as a key part of the provisioning system for Dutch ships traveling across the world. Without the daily work of these fishermen, the Dutch naval and merchant fleets would have faced considerable shortages, which could have jeopardized the success of Dutch trade. The fishermen of Zeeland were not just part of a local economy, they were essential to the operation of the Dutch Republic's naval power. They helped supply provisions for the Dutch Navy and merchant fleets, ensuring that the country's ships had enough food, especially dried fish and salted meats, to make long journeys across the oceans. Fish from Zeeland, particularly herring, became a staple of the Dutch diet, and its salted and dried varieties were exported to other European countries. But their role was not limited to supplying food. Zeeland's fishermen also acted as a kind of early warning system for the Dutch coast. Their intimate knowledge of the waters, tides, and currents around the region made them key players in defending the Dutch coastline from foreign invasion. They were the first to spot foreign ships entering Dutch waters, often notifying the authorities before the larger naval fleet could mobilize. Though they were not military men, their work was critical in maintaining the safety and security of the Republic's coastal defenses. In 1589, a particularly noteworthy event occurred that sheds light on the crucial role Zeeland's fishermen played in the defense of the Dutch coast. The Spanish, having long coveted control over the Netherlands, launched a naval attack against Zeeland, aiming to disrupt Dutch trade routes and undermine the growing economic power of the Dutch Republic. While the Spanish fleet was formidable, they underestimated the vigilance of Zeeland's fishermen, a group of fishermen from the island of Walcheren. Upon spotting the approaching Spanish fleet, quickly alerted local authorities, who in turn managed to muster a defense in time to thwart the Spanish invasion, although not directly involved in combat. The fishermen's timely warning allowed the Dutch Navy to prepare and protect the shores. Their swift response to the threat prevented a potentially disastrous raid that could have severely impacted Dutch trade. The event was significant, not just for the military success it ensured, but for highlighting the fishermen's role in maintaining the security of the Republic's maritime interests. In addition to their defensive work, Zeeland's fishermen were also responsible for ensuring the flow of goods essential to Dutch economic dominance. The herring trade, in particular, was central to the Dutch economy. Herring was not only a vital food source within the Netherlands, but also one of the most important exports to neighboring European nations. Zeeland's fishermen worked tirelessly to catch, process, and export herring, and their fleets, operating from harbors like Middelburg and Vlissingen, were a key part of the Netherlands' economic engine. However, the lives of Zeeland's fishermen were not without their hardships. The work was grueling and dangerous, with long hours at sea and the constant threat of adverse weather conditions. Moreover, the fishermen of Zeeland had to contend with the political pressures of living in a region caught between Dutch independence and Spanish attempts to regain control over the Low Countries. Despite these challenges, Zeeland's fishermen continued their work with resilience, playing a vital role in feeding the growing population of the Dutch Republic and sustaining its maritime power. What often goes unrecognized in the broader historical narrative is the deep connection that Zeeland's fishermen had to the land and sea. Their livelihoods were dependent on an intimate knowledge of the waters, the tides, and the fish stocks. They were not merely laborers in the traditional sense. They were guardians of a way of life that blended economic activity with the security of the Dutch Republic. Through their work, they helped to cement the Netherlands' position as a dominant maritime and commercial power. The fishermen's contributions to Dutch naval and economic success were not confined to their own time. The infrastructure and techniques they developed for managing herring fisheries and processing the catch laid the groundwork for future economic activities, including the expansion of Dutch fishing fleets and the commercialization of the fishing industry. Their influence extended far beyond the immediate impact of their work in the 16th century. Zeeland's fishermen helped to create a sustainable foundation for Dutch maritime power, which would continue to grow and support the Dutch economy in the centuries to come. Though these fishermen remain largely uncelebrated in the grand histories of the Dutch Golden Age, their contributions were essential to the survival and success of the Dutch Republic. Without them, the Dutch naval and merchant fleets would have faced insurmountable logistical and provisioning challenges. These ordinary men, working in the shadows of more famous maritime figures, played a quiet but indispensable role in shaping the course of Dutch history. While the contributions of Zeeland's fishermen to Dutch economic life were significant. Their role in the broader maritime strategy of the Dutch Republic cannot be overstated. The Netherlands, situated in a region crisscrossed by rivers and bordering the turbulent North Sea, relied heavily on its maritime prowess to secure its status as a global power. In this strategic context, Zeeland's fishermen were not just workers, they were active participants in a highly organized, complex, and growing maritime defense system. Their deep knowledge of the region's waters, their familiarity with tides, currents, and shoals, as well as their vigilance in guarding against enemy vessels, placed them at the heart of the Dutch Republic's maritime defense strategy in the 16th and early 17th centuries, as the Dutch were embroiled in their long struggle for independence from Spain. Control over the seas was crucial. The war with Spain had not just political ramifications, but economic ones as well. The Dutch had to protect their lucrative trade routes, especially those related to herring, timber, and then other critical goods. Since the Dutch Republic was still emerging as a fully independent power, it had to defend its economic lifeblood, its maritime trade against powerful enemies. Zeeland's fishermen, familiar with every bay and inlet, played a vital role in this defense. One of the most critical moments during this period came in 1600, when the Spanish launched another attempt to blockade Dutch shipping in the North Sea. While the official Dutch Navy engaged the Spanish forces in larger naval battles, Zeeland's fishermen were called upon to assist in a different capacity. They were tasked with guiding merchant vessels through the treacherous waters, helping to avoid the Spanish ships that sought to ambush Dutch trade. The fishermen's intimate knowledge of the local waters made them invaluable in this task. They knew every sandbank, every navigable channel, and they could read the shifting tides better than anyone else. During this period, many of the Dutch fishermen took up arms alongside their fellow sailors and soldiers. They were not simply supporting the naval fleet by providing food, but actively engaging in the defense of Dutch maritime sovereignty. The local fishing communities organized small defensive units, patrolling the waters around the coast and ensuring that Dutch merchant ships could make their way to port safely. These militias, often made up of fishermen who had little formal military training, but who had honed their skills through years of working on the seas, were crucial in safeguarding the vital supply lines to the Netherlands. The fishermen's role in military defense was not confined to such direct engagement. They also helped keep a sharp lookout for enemy vessels. In areas like the Zeeland Islands, where much of the Dutch Navy's trade and resources passed through, these fishermen often acted as the first line of defense. Their early warning systems, alerting naval commanders to the presence of enemy ships or suspicious vessels, made them a critical part of the Dutch Republic's ability to control its waters and defend its trade routes. Without the vigilance of these fishermen, the Dutch Navy would have faced greater challenges in safeguarding their maritime empire. Zeeland's fishermen were not only engaged in defense, but also worked to secure vital economic advantages for the Republic. One of their most important contributions was maintaining the flow of herring, a key export that fueled much of the Dutch economy. The herring industry, which was centered in Zeeland, was vital for feeding the growing population of the Dutch cities and for providing a significant source of income through trade. The fishermen, through their ability to fish large quantities of herring and bring it to market efficiently, directly contributed to the economic success of the Dutch Republic. Moreover, their role in herring fisheries helped to shape Dutch global trade strategies. As Dutch ships sailed to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they relied on the constant supply of herring to sustain their long voyages. The salted and dried fish not only fed the crews of the Dutch ships, but also became an important part of the cargo being traded in distant colonies. The fishermen of Zeeland were therefore central to the success of the Dutch East India Company and the broader Dutch presence in global commerce. Without their steady provision of goods, the country's trading empire could have faltered. In addition to their contribution to herring trade, Zeeland's fishermen were also engaged in the production and trade of other marine resources, such as salt, which was crucial for preserving fish, and flax, which was used for sails and rigging. The maritime economy of the Dutch Republic was supported by a web of interconnected industries, with the fishing industry sitting at the core. While the merchant class may have received the accolades and the credit for the Republic's trade success, it was the fishermen, working at sea, who provided the foundational resources that made it all possible. However, despite their crucial role, the fishermen of Zeeland remained largely overlooked in the broader historical narrative. The success of the Dutch Republic's maritime endeavors was often attributed to the merchants who commanded ships or the naval officers who led battles. Yet, as we look closer at the network of industries that enabled the Republic's economic rise, we see that the fishermen were, in many ways, the unsung heroes who enabled Dutch dominance on the seas. Their skill, resilience, and vital contributions were essential to the creation of the Dutch maritime empire. The 17th century saw an increasing formalization of the fishing industry, with guilds and associations emerging to regulate the trade and ensure its continued success. Yet, even as the industry grew and the Dutch Republic became more powerful, the legacy of the fishermen's quiet work remained undervalued. While their role in provisioning and defense had been critical, it was not until later, when the maritime industry was fully modernized, that their labor and its importance to Dutch society were fully recognized. In the end, the fishermen of Zeeland were more than just providers of fish, they were guardians of the Republic's maritime strength. Without their vigilance, skill, and knowledge of the seas, the Dutch Republic would not have been able to establish its global empire. The legacy of Zeeland's fishermen is one of quiet but indispensable contribution to the prosperity and power of the Netherlands. As the Dutch Republic continued to expand its maritime empire throughout the 17th century, the foundational role played by Zeeland's fishermen in supporting this growth cannot be overstated. Their contributions, while often overlooked in favor of more celebrated figures in Dutch history, were instrumental in the Republic's rise as a global trading power. The fishing industry, led by these hard-working and resourceful men, was not just a part of Dutch life. It was a vital pillar of the Dutch economy and maritime strength. The success of the Dutch fleet and merchant ships would not have been possible without the steady supply of fish to feed the crews during long voyages. Herring, the primary catch of Zeeland's fishermen, was especially important as it could be preserved and stored for extended periods, making it ideal for long sea journeys. The fishermen of Zeeland didn't just supply food, they enabled the Dutch ships to sail farther, longer, and with greater efficiency. Their contribution ensured that the Dutch East India Company and Dutch merchant fleets could reach the farthest corners of the world, from the spice islands of Southeast Asia to the trading posts along the African coast and the Americas. Beyond provisioning the Dutch ships, Zeeland's fishermen were also crucial in the development of the Netherlands' fishing economy. As the demand for herring grew, especially in the burgeoning cities of the Dutch Republic, the fishermen adapted, expanding their fleets and adopting new fishing techniques. The technological advancements in shipbuilding and fishing methods that emerged during the 16th and 17th centuries were pioneered in places like Zeeland, where local shipbuilders and fishermen worked closely to develop the types of vessels and nets needed to harvest herring on an industrial scale. The development of the herring industry in Zeeland not only supplied a critical food source to the Dutch population, but also made the Netherlands a key player in the European fishing trade. Dutch herring was a highly sought after commodity, and its trade contributed significantly to the prosperity of the Republic. Through the fishermen's labor, Zeeland became the center of this lucrative trade, with merchant fleets carrying salted herring to markets across Europe. This trade in fish, along with other industries such as shipbuilding, flax production, and salt, created a diverse, interconnected maritime economy that helped to establish the Dutch Republic as a leading power in global commerce. As the Dutch Navy grew stronger in the 17th century, the importance of maintaining a powerful and reliable merchant fleet became increasingly apparent. The fishermen of Zeeland played an essential role in ensuring that the Republic's ships had enough provisions to sustain their voyages. They were, in a sense, the unsung logistical backbone of the Dutch naval and merchant enterprises. Without their hard work, the Dutch fleet would not have been able to exert its dominance over the seas, nor would the country have been able to maintain its status as a global economic powerhouse. Yet, despite their critical role, Zeeland's fishermen remained largely invisible in the grand historical narrative. The emphasis on the exploits of the captains and traders, men who sailed on the ships or commanded fleets, overshadowed the contributions of those who kept the Dutch maritime system running behind the scenes. The fishermen who ensured the fleets were well fed and who helped defend the coastline were not given the same recognition, even though their efforts were just as vital to the success of the Dutch Republic. The lasting legacy of Zeeland's fishermen, however, lies in the foundations they laid for the Dutch maritime empire. Their resilience and adaptability in the face of adversity allowed the Dutch Republic to secure its position in global trade and politics. Over time, the fishing industry in Zeeland became a model for other regions of Europe, and the Dutch innovations in fishing techniques and shipbuilding helped to transform the industry worldwide. By the end of the 17th century, as the Dutch Golden Age began to wane, the fishermen's role in the country's success had become a distant memory. While their contributions to the Republic's prosperity were acknowledged in passing, their vital role in maintaining Dutch naval and trade power was often overlooked in favor of the more visible achievements of the merchant class, the captains, and the naval officers. However, the fishermen of Zeeland had helped to create an infrastructure that allowed the Dutch Republic to thrive and hold sway over the seas. They had been the quiet strength behind Dutch maritime dominance, ensuring that the Republic's fleets were supplied and ready for the challenges of global trade and naval conflict. As we reflect on the legacy of Zeeland's fishermen, we are reminded of the countless other unsung figures who have shaped history through their tireless, often invisible labor. The fishermen, with their knowledge of the sea, their craft, and their dedication to providing for the nation, were integral to the Dutch Republic's success. In the grand sweep of history, they may not have been the celebrated heroes, but without them, the story of the Dutch Golden Age would have been incomplete. Their legacy is not just one of hard work and quiet contribution. It is a testament to the importance of all individuals, no matter how seemingly small their role, in shaping the history of a nation. Zeeland's fishermen were essential to the rise of the Dutch Republic, and their contributions remain a vital, though often forgotten, part of the country's maritime legacy. The quiet architects of Amsterdam's canals, the builders of the city's maritime infrastructure. The world knows Amsterdam for its iconic canals, which wind through the city like veins carrying the lifeblood of one of the most prosperous urban centers in history. The canals are often romanticized in paintings, literature, and modern tourism. They symbolize the Dutch Republic's triumph in urban planning, trade, and maritime commerce. However, behind the beauty and the allure of these water-filled avenues lies a story that is rarely told. The story of the laborers and engineers, many of whom were unsung workers, who built the canals that made Amsterdam the commercial capital of the world during the 17th century. Amsterdam's canals were not simply decorative or a matter of aesthetic appeal. They were an essential part of the city's infrastructure, designed to manage water, facilitate trade, and support the city's growing maritime dominance. The city's remarkable canal system was central to its role as a trading hub and maritime power. However, the story of how these canals came to be of the planners, laborers, and engineers who constructed them remains one of the most overlooked aspects of the Dutch Golden Age. The project to create Amsterdam's canal system began in earnest in the early 17th century. At the time, Amsterdam was bursting at the seams. The city's rapid growth, fueled by the success of the Dutch East India Company and its dominance in trade, meant that there was a pressing need to accommodate a growing population, facilitate trade, and protect the city from flooding. Amsterdam was situated in the middle of the Zuiderzee, now the IJsselmeer, an area prone to flooding, and the necessity of controlling water levels was paramount. The city's leaders realized that a well-planned canal system could address multiple problems. It could serve as a defensive feature, regulate water levels, provide efficient transportation routes, and allow space for urban development. But constructing a system of canals across a city was no small task. It required extensive planning, skilled labor, and coordination of various trades and crafts. While the famous city planners and architects such as Hendrik de Keyser and Pieter de Swart are often credited with overseeing the project, the true work behind the canals was carried out by countless laborers whose names are now lost to history. In 1613, the city of Amsterdam officially launched the construction of the first major canal, the Harengracht, a project that would continue for decades. This canal, along with others such as the Prinsengracht and Keizersgracht, was designed in concentric semicircles, with the city center at the core. But behind the cutting-edge urban planning were the engineers, diggers, and workers who spent countless hours manually digging through marshy soil, lifting heavy loads of earth, and constructing the intricate system of locks, bridges, and dikes that would allow the city to control its water levels. The labor required to construct the canals was immense. Workers, many of whom were peasants or migrant laborers from rural parts of the Netherlands, were employed in difficult, dangerous conditions. The process of digging through soft soil and swampy ground often led to unstable working conditions, and many workers faced the risk of injury or even death. The laborers were not only responsible for digging the canals, but also for clearing the land, laying down wooden piles, and fortifying the banks. They were also tasked with creating the network of sluices that would regulate the water levels and ensure that the canals would not flood the city in times of heavy rain or high tides. The canal project relied on a wide range of skills, many of which were specialized and required years of experience. Builders, stonemasons, woodworkers, and engineers worked together to create the complex infrastructure that would support Amsterdam's canals. These men were not just constructing a city's streets, they were designing an intricate, functional system that would propel Amsterdam to economic greatness. But despite the importance of their work, the contributions of these workers were rarely acknowledged in the records of the time. The well-documented stories of the wealthy merchant families who lived along the canals, or of the great ship captains and traders who reaped the benefits of the city's maritime success, overshadowed the humble efforts of the men who physically constructed the city's foundation. The architects and planners may have had the vision, but it was the laborers who brought that vision to life, carving the canals that would allow Amsterdam to become the bustling port city that it was. This silent revolution in Amsterdam's infrastructure was, in many ways, the foundation for the city's prosperity. The efficient movement of goods via the canals allowed merchants to quickly and cheaply transport their wares, ensuring that Amsterdam became the heart of Dutch global trade. The canals also played a vital role in the defense of the city, allowing for quick movement of troops in times of conflict and serving as a natural barrier against invading forces. The significance of the canals cannot be understated. They were central to the Dutch Golden Age. In the years following the construction of the canals, they would come to symbolize not just the brilliance of Dutch engineering, but also the ambition and resourcefulness of a growing nation. The city's ability to adapt to its environment and use water to its advantage became a model for other European cities. However, the true cost of Amsterdam's canal system, the labor of those who constructed it, is a forgotten chapter in the story of the Dutch Republic. The story of the workers who built Amsterdam's canals is a reminder of the countless individuals whose labor shapes our world. Even if their names are not remembered in history, their efforts may not have been glamorous, but they were critical in laying the groundwork for one of the most successful and powerful economies in the world. The canals of Amsterdam, which remain one of the city's most iconic features, are a testament to the vision of Dutch urban planners and the quiet, tireless work of the men who built them. As Amsterdam's canal system took shape in the early 17th century, the city experienced an economic transformation that would cement its place as one of the most prosperous urban centers in the world. The canals, which began as a pragmatic solution to the city's problems with water control and urban expansion, quickly became a cornerstone of Amsterdam's burgeoning trade empire. The efficient transportation network they provided enabled Amsterdam to thrive as the epicenter of Dutch commerce and industry during the Golden Age. Yet, this success was not solely the result of visionary city planning. It was built upon the labor of those who physically constructed the canals, and the broader economic impact of these waterways cannot be understood without acknowledging their role in facilitating global trade. Amsterdam's growth as a maritime power was driven by the Dutch East India Company, VOC, which monopolized the trade routes between Europe and Asia. The success of the VOC depended not only on the ships that sailed the world's oceans, but also on the efficient logistics within the city. The canals were a critical part of that logistics, providing a reliable and cost-effective way to transport goods from the city's docks to warehouses, merchant houses, and markets. The ability to quickly and cheaply move goods, especially bulk items like grain, herring, and timber, allowed Amsterdam to flourish as the primary trading hub for the Netherlands. Before the canals, Amsterdam was constrained by the narrow and crowded streets that had formed around the medieval city center. These streets were insufficient for the scale of trade that was growing in the city. Ships docked along the waterfront, but unloading cargo was often a slow and cumbersome process. Merchants struggled to get goods from the docks to their warehouses, and the congestion in the streets slowed the movement of goods. The canal system changed all of this. As the canals were dug and connected, merchants gained access to a new, efficient network of waterways that allowed ships to dock directly in front of their warehouses. Goods could be quickly transported via boat from the docks to the heart of the city, where they were then stored, processed, or sold. The ease of transport helped Amsterdam's merchants engage in trade more quickly and at lower costs, making the city an even more attractive destination for traders and investors. The economic impact of the canals on Dutch trade cannot be overstated. The canals not only facilitated the transport of goods, but also contributed to the specialization of Amsterdam's economy. Each district of the city, with its network of canals, became dedicated to specific industries. For example, the Herengracht and Keizersgracht canals were home to wealthy merchant families and their opulent houses, while the Prinsengracht Canal was closely tied to Amsterdam's herring industry, with warehouses and fishing docks located along its banks. The canals allowed for the growth of specialized commercial districts where trade, industry, and innovation could flourish in tandem. In addition to facilitating trade within the city, the canals also played a pivotal role in Amsterdam's role as a major port in international trade. Goods shipped from the farthest corners of the world, whether from the East Indies, Africa, or the Americas, arrived at Amsterdam's docks and were then distributed via the canals to markets throughout the Netherlands and beyond. The city became the hub for goods ranging from spices and textiles to slaves and precious metals, and the canals were essential in keeping this global trade running smoothly. Moreover, the canals also allowed Amsterdam to grow as a center of finance. The proximity of banks, stock exchanges, and trading houses to the waterways created a financial ecosystem that encouraged economic activity. The city's access to financial capital, coupled with its role in global trade, created an environment where business could thrive. Amsterdam's financial institutions, many of which were located along the canals, helped fund the expansion of Dutch overseas ventures, including the VOC and the West India Company, further boosting the Dutch economy. The development of the canal system also had a profound effect on the housing market in Amsterdam. As the canals expanded outward from the city center, they opened up new areas for development, and a series of grand canal-side homes were built to accommodate the growing number of wealthy merchants, investors, and traders. These homes were not only a reflection of the wealth that Amsterdam's merchants had accumulated through trade, but they also symbolized the importance of the canal system as a driver of the city's economic success. Wealthy residents, often involved in the trading or shipping industries, could afford to live along the canals, and many of these mansions still stand today as a testament to the city's golden age. The demand for housing also led to innovations in urban planning and architecture. The construction of buildings along the canals required the development of new building techniques, and the need for more space led to the construction of narrow, deep houses designed to maximize the use of limited land. These homes, often built with distinctive facades and large windows overlooking the water, became an architectural signature of Amsterdam, reinforcing the connection between the city's economic prosperity and its canal infrastructure. Yet, it wasn't just the merchant class that benefited from the canals. The city's working class residents, many of whom were employed in industries related to the shipping and fishing trade, also gained from the efficiencies brought by the canals. These canals provided a means of swift and cheap transportation, which allowed workers to move goods efficiently and reduce the cost of shipping supplies across the city. In turn, the growth of Amsterdam's economy supported the creation of jobs and fostered a sense of social mobility, at least within the confines of the growing urban center. In summary, the construction of Amsterdam's canal system transformed the city into one of the world's most important trade centers during the Dutch Golden Age. The economic impact of the canals was felt not only by the merchant elites who profited from trade, but also by the working class laborers who benefited from the increased efficiency in transport and trade. The canals allowed Amsterdam to maximize its role as the center of global commerce, creating an environment in which the city's economic strength was intrinsically linked to its innovative water infrastructure. But while the canals were instrumental to Amsterdam's success, the true labor that went into their construction by the thousands of unnamed engineers, workers, and craftsmen remains largely forgotten. Their efforts were not as visible in the historical record as the traders or the wealthy merchants, yet their contributions were just as vital to the economic rise of the Netherlands. As we come to the final section of this story, it becomes clear that the impact of Amsterdam's canal system was not just confined to the 17th century or to the city itself. The canals were central to the Dutch Republic's rise as a dominant global power, and their legacy continues to shape the nation today. The canal system not only enabled Amsterdam to function as a vital hub for international trade, but it also became a model for other cities around the world, demonstrating how strategic urban planning could serve as the backbone of economic prosperity. The success of Amsterdam's canal system directly contributed to the Netherlands' maritime dominance, which, in turn, allowed the country to maintain a powerful presence on the world stage. By facilitating the movement of goods, whether raw materials, luxury items, or provisions for long voyages, the canals played a critical role in supporting the global trading network that was the hallmark of the Dutch Golden Age. This network, fueled by the Dutch East India Company and other trading ventures, reached across continents, connecting Europe to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and placing Amsterdam at the center of it all. The logistical efficiency provided by the canals also helped the Dutch to maintain military and economic influence during a period of fierce competition with other European powers, including Spain, England, and France. The rapid and cost effective transport of goods and the ability to quickly mobilize resources allowed the Dutch Republic to defend its interests both on land and at sea. The canals played a role in transporting soldiers, provisions, and supplies to strategic points along the coast, making it easier for the Dutch to protect their territories and shipping lanes. In addition to their economic and military significance, the canals helped to shape the political and social structure of Amsterdam. The canal system fostered the growth of an increasingly stratified society, where wealth and power were distributed based on one's proximity to the water. The elite merchant families who resided along the canals not only enjoyed direct access to trade routes, but also used their canal-side mansions to showcase their wealth and status. These families were often instrumental in shaping the policies and direction of the Dutch Republic, using their resources to fund exploration, trade missions, and military efforts. The canals also contributed to the development of Amsterdam as a center of finance. The city's proximity to the canals allowed for the easy flow of goods and capital, creating a financial ecosystem that supported both small traders and large-scale enterprises. Amsterdam's stock exchange, one of the earliest in the world, thrived thanks to the canal system, which provided an efficient transportation for goods and allowed financiers to track their investments in real time. This financial infrastructure made it easier for Dutch traders to fund their ventures, and it helped the Netherlands establish itself as a leader in global trade. As the 17th century progressed, the power of the Dutch Republic was increasingly defined by its control over not just the seas, but also the complex network of inland waterways that connected its cities, towns, and regions. The canals were a critical part of this network, ensuring that goods could move efficiently between Amsterdam and the rest of the Netherlands. The country's entire maritime and commercial success relied on the canal system, as it was the key to keeping trade flowing and the economy humming. Even after the height of the Dutch Golden Age, the legacy of the canals continued to shape the Netherlands' place in the world. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as the Dutch Empire declined and global trade shifted, the canals remained a crucial part of the country's infrastructure. They allowed the Dutch to maintain strong commercial ties with former colonies, such as Indonesia, Suriname, and the Caribbean, even as European powers like Britain and France began to eclipse the Dutch in global power. In the modern era, Amsterdam's canals have evolved into a symbol of the city's rich history and economic legacy. Today, the canals are not only a major tourist attraction, but also a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of the workers who built them. The city's canal network, which stretches across more than 100 kilometers, has been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing its importance to both Dutch and global history. The canals have been maintained and preserved as a living reminder of the past, and their legacy continues to inspire urban planning and infrastructure development worldwide. Yet, despite the canal's lasting significance, the workers who built them remain largely forgotten in the broader historical narrative. The laborers who dug the canals, engineered the sluices, and constructed the bridges are rarely acknowledged. Despite the immense challenges they faced in creating such an intricate and essential system, their efforts, which were foundational to the success of Amsterdam and the Dutch Republic, were performed without fanfare or recognition. It is only through a closer examination of the hidden history of the canals that we come to appreciate the true scale of their contribution. The legacy of the canal builders of Amsterdam is a reminder that great cities and great nations are built not just by the visionaries who plan and direct, but by the workers who physically create the infrastructure that supports the economy, the culture, and the political power. The canals of Amsterdam, while iconic and beautiful, are also a testament to the silent work of thousands of individuals whose labor laid the foundation for one of the most prosperous periods in Dutch history. As we look back on the impact of the canals, it becomes clear that the physical labor of these forgotten workers played a role just as significant as the grand naval voyages or merchant expeditions that are typically celebrated. The canals, in all their quiet beauty and practicality, were the true lifeblood of Amsterdam and of the Dutch Republic itself. The labor that went into creating them was foundational to the Republic's success, and it remains a lasting symbol of the quiet strength that built one of the world's greatest maritime powers.